Adoption, really brokish. Are we starting to stretch it a little bit? Well, if we're talking about adoption, y'all must only be talking about transracial adoption, right? And if we're not talking about transracial adoption, how could adoptions of Black children by Black families possibly be something that's harmful? Well, I'm glad y'all asked because we are talking about it after the break.
Brokers, welcome to another episode of Brokish, where we talk about the unbelievable ish this country has done to keep us broke. Now here are your hosts, Amber and Erika.
Hey, everybody, this is Amber.
And I'm Erika.
And today on Brokish, we are talking about something that's been in Erika's sha-na-na for a long, long time.
Really?
Adoption.
It hasn't necessarily been in my sha-na-na, but it has been something that I've been wanting to delve more deeply into. So I'm happy that we have a guest that I mistakenly left on the screen and at the beginning. And that's okay. We'll bring it back on later.
Let's mark this day in history that Erika made a mistake because y'all know she was talking about me so bad, child. Ooh.
Wow. Amber, really?
Me and you? Sip some of this municipal water, okay?
Look, let me just tell you, Amber, I am going through a lot right now, okay? And one of the things is, Amber, do you see this? Can you see this?
See what? I don't.
Amber, I have this huge pimple. Can I just say, nobody asked me this, but perimenopause, like it's just something. And the people don't tell you about it. And then you walking around here and all of a sudden you have a beard and pimples. And you didn't mean to. And I'm just saying, I'm dealing with a lot. So yeah, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. But that's what's going on in my world.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, even when you put your whole side of your face in them people's screen, I still didn't see it. And you look good. You look good.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe because your finger covering it. I don't see it.
So big. I had to buy
but
concealer.
You don't look like what you're going through.
Oh, good.
You don't look like what you're going through. You don't look like what you're going through. How you doing otherwise besides your pimple that can't nobody see? How you doing? What you been doing?
Well, for us, Amber, this is the back to school time for us. And I feel like the summer flew by. And I didn't have an appreciation when the elders used to talk about how time flies. I was just like, y'all are old and tripping. But time is elusive. It just keeps going. And I cannot hold on to it in a way that is shocking to me. And I have never experienced before. So back to school time, making sure these kids have all this stuff, just everybody wants money. I'm just going to put my credit card on the regular internet, not just on the dark web where it already is. So put it on the regular internet and y'all just come and get it because it's just, yeah. But you have a bunch of kids, so you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm there times 25. And I have already put my credit card on the internet, because I have to swipe it so much. But I feel the same way. I also realized I was talking to some people on Kelsey's basketball team the other day. I just think 2023 hasn't had no home training for everybody. I feel like everybody is sort of in this collective, like, whoa, child, this is going real fast. And it's a lot happening for everybody. Just like life is just lifing at a very rapid pace, it seems like this year. Like it's always something in 2023. And it don't even necessarily have to be big things or catastrophic things. It just seems like it's just always something around the corner. Like, gotta do this, gotta do that. So, yes, I get it. We did back to school shopping yesterday, and I had to come home and take a BC powder and a nap because I was like, that was a lot.
Amber, we're going to start getting sponsored by BC powder because this is the second episode you done talked about BC powder. And in the comments, one of the people was laughing at you talking about BC powder. And I'm like, here you go again. Do we need to reach out to them people or what?
We really do because they are the reason why I was able to take 423 kids back to school shopping yesterday. So, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you made it through. I'm glad we're making it through. And
Amen.
Yeah, so we're here and I'm excited because like you mentioned, this is a topic that I have been thinking about for a little while. So for the brokers who are with us all the time, y'all might remember we had Amanda Wallace from Operation Stop CPS on. And she was talking about the CPS system and social work and just things that before I really thought about it, you're thinking like, what could be wrong with CPS, right? You're helping children. That is what their goal is, right? They're helping children, they're trying to reunify families and all this kind of stuff. What could be the harm in that? And so in learning the harm in that, it, of course, a logical extension of that, at least for me, was then thinking about adoption and how the adoption process might also be flawed and might also be harmful. And I just don't have any experience with it. So y'all know my Twitter addiction that, I think the man wanted me to not have a Twitter. He trying to drive it in the ground, so I can't have a Twitter addiction, right? I'm not going to be able to have one because it's going to be gone. But I'm scrolling and then I see like adoptee Twitter. And I'm like, well, adoptee Twitter, what's that all about? And so I'm scrolling and then I run across this podcast, Adoptees Crossing Lines. And I'm like, what's that all about? So today with us, we have Leah. And Leah comes from the Adoptees Crossing Lines podcast. And she is a Black and Latinx same race adoptee. And she spent some time in foster care before being adopted. And she is the founder of the podcast, Adoptees Crossing Lines, where she and her co host have really honest conversations about being an adoptee and the industry, and just think about adoption as an industry. But anyway, Leah is also an abolitionist, and she's passionate about social issues and just using her voice to amplify marginalized communities, whoever, wherever they might be. So, Leah, thank you for joining Brokish.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here today.
Yes. So normally when people come on, Amber and I are like, where are you from? Who your people are? And I started thinking about that question and I was like, wow, that's a lot for a topic about adoption, right? And so as we sort of come to you today, if you could really just take us through your story and your history in terms of being an adoptee and just that whole process for the context.
Absolutely. So my story begins in New York, in the Brooklyn area. My bio mom gave birth to 5 kids. She also was adopted herself, so there's some intergenerational trauma there. But she, excuse me, she ended up losing custody of all of her kids. So some of us went into the system. Some of us ended up getting raised by grandparents, which were her like adoptive parents. And then some of us eventually ended up getting adopted out of the system. So I spent time in foster care for a couple of years. And then I eventually got adopted. And the whole reason I even went into the system is basically because my mom was a poor Black woman. She had her mental health issues. She was just out here trying to survive. My mom was a sex worker. So she was just doing her best out here with her 8th grade education. She left home very young, told it was a very like toxic family that she was being raised by as well. And so she wanted to escape that. But yeah, the government stepped in and said that she was unfit to raise her kids because she didn't have, the resources, the money to take care of us. And even when other people wanted to step in and take care of us, they also were too poor. And so they put
Wow.
us into the system. And I ended up getting adopted by a Black family who had infertility issues. So they had had a child before adopting me, but he didn't live very long. He lived for like less than a day. And so they were like, the story I'm told is that, my adopted dad didn't want to put my adopted mom through that. And so somebody at their church introduced them to like adoption and stuff like that. And so they decided to look into it and then eventually adopted me. But all the while, we're still trying to get pregnant and have their own kid, like a lot of adoptive parents do. So they eventually ended up having their own kid. So I was raised with my sister, their biological child, and didn't have like the best childhood, to be quite honest. I think a lot of people, like you said, hear adoption, hear CPS, and you think that they're here to help children, but they're really not. And even the reasons that people adopt are often for their own personal and selfish reasons. They're trying for excuse me, for my adoptive parents, they were trying to fill this void of losing a child, which, I think that's an awful thing to go through. I empathize with that. But I don't think adoption is the solution to that. But yeah, so I was raised by a Black family, a Black Christian, devout Christian family, and experienced quite a bit of abuse in their home. And so for me, adoption just never really felt like this good thing to me. Like, I didn't understand why I had to be removed to be put into this situation that really wasn't any better. Like, it might have been better from a financial standpoint,
Sure.
but from like a loving and caring and emotionally available and all of that stuff, it really wasn't a great situation.
Leah,
You know,
you've said so much there. Sorry, go ahead, Amber.
no, I was just going to say, I know there are a lot of people who might genuinely be struggling with what the connection is between this episode and what we do here on Brokish. And I think some of the things that you brought up really illustrate how, when you set even something that is noble and good in purpose on top of an exploitative system, that exploitation, that commodification of human bodies cannot be extricated from whatever you sit on top of it, even if it's good and noble. And so, listening you talk about, people's motives, right? Like why they want the child or what's going on, and facing the truth that it's not always about the child. Like, that is almost mirroring what happens in racialized capitalist systems, how we take bodies and we use them for our own benefit, for our own consumption, without regard to how it affects the other person. And so, like, listening to you talk about that, I just want to be clear that people don't miss that that's basically why we're doing this, to talk about the fact that a lot of times that undercurrent is not interrogated. And then people like you end up with the stories and experiences that they do.
And so,
What were you going to say, Erika? I didn't mean that.
no, I was just going to say, first of all, Leah, thank you for sharing all of that. And I wanted to go in 6 different directions because there was just a lot in what you shared. So if we go back to Amber's point about, why we talk about this on Brokish, let's start with the piece that, again, I don't want to have to start with this piece, but let's start with the money, right? So you talked about your mother was a poor Black woman, right? How many of us know poor Black women? How many of us were raised by poor Black women, right? But when we think about the system that came to rescue you, I presume that they rescued you and took you, like you said, you were in foster care and they had to have resources to be able to place you in foster care. Your adoptive parents had to have resources to be able to adopt you. So can you tell us about just your thoughts now on the other side of things as you think about what might have been available or helpful in terms of being able to have your mother to be able to keep you? Do you think that at the end of the day, money was the problem?
Yeah, I think money was absolutely the biggest issue. Some things that I think could have been done. Um, Foster parents are subsidized for fostering kids. So that same money that you're giving to foster parents, why not just give it to the family?
Well, because your mother was a sex worker. They're not going to give you, they're
Right.
not, like, they
Right.
can't do
They
that.
don't want no parts of that. So, yeah, why not give it to the family to keep the family together? Because I think at the end of the day, I think if I were to say, do you think that children belong with their families? Do you think that they belong with their biological families? I think that most people would agree, right? So I don't understand why we're giving that same money to strangers to raise when we know that family separation is not good. Like, people were outraged with all the kids at the border, the kids in cages, right? But I think because it was something that was so visceral, like something that you could see, I think people had that type of reaction to it. But the same thing is happening with kids in foster care and kids who are being adopted. We're being separated from our families too. It's just that it's been there's this fairy tale narrative that's out there. But I would say that's one of the ways, is to redistribute the money, and then actually like provide the resources that the families actually need. Because oftentimes what happens is, some type of report is filed, which can be filed anonymously depending on the
Mhm.
state. And then CPS investigates that report. And then there is some sort of list that is often ridiculous that the parents have to go through to meet all these expectations to get their kids back. And if they don't, then they terminate your parental rights. The US terminates more parental rights than any other country in the world.
Not surprising.
So I think those are two of the ways that things could be different. And then also, I mean, states are incentivized to help, I say that in air quotes, help kids who are in foster care get adopted. They actually get like a bonus,
Mhm.
like from the Adoption Safe and Families Act, like is what incorporated that in 1997, I believe. And so there's literal like monetary incentives to separate children from their families. There's no incentives to give that money to the families and keep them together. There's more of an incentive to just keep placing kids in these homes as quickly as possible so that these states can get their checks. They also get checks for like, SSI benefits, or if you've had a parent that died, sometimes that money goes to the state. Like, it's not even being spent to help the child. So there's so much like corruption, there's so much money that is involved. I mean, at the end of the day, capitalism is a hell of a drug, and it drives so many of the systems that are a part of like family policing or the child welfare system.
And it's so interesting that you talk about the resources and the money, because just I know about a family who adopted some children, and they did have several behavioral and emotional needs. So what happened is they have this group called Post Adoption Services. And Post Adoption Services provides behavioral health, occupational therapy, counseling. They have all of these wraparound services that get provided to the children and the family after the adoption happens. And I'm just like, but y'all, why we got like, we could use those same resources that you are putting out, because you still have to shore up this child, right? Like, these children are still going through a lot, and you literally could. And I just feel like, yes, of course, capitalism, racism, all those things, but I'm like, I just feel like they don't trust Black people with anything, because a lot of times we're talking about Black people, we're talking about minority people, and it's like, I can't trust y'all with this money, right? Like, I have to send these people through this training, and then I can trust them, and they're legitimized to be able to have these same resources that they could do to preserve the families. And that's just so hard for me to understand, how we watch that and still think that it's benevolence. Like, that family was so good, they adopted those children. That is such a blessing, and it's like,
Or, or even if we back up, like imagine if your mama could have got a job and got paid what white men get paid.
well,
Like, okay, we don't have to go that far down the line. Like, imagine if she would have been able to get a job and get paid what her male counterparts got paid. Because for a lot of people, sex work is the kind of job that you can do that offers flexibility, that offers you an opportunity to earn the wages that you can't get if you go work somewhere else. And so, yes, we talk about this this exploitation down the line, but like, even let's just start at the beginning. Like, imagine how different this world would be if women could go out and they could make the same dollar as a man.
well, let's start with
You
the
know,
white woman. But anyway, we're not going to go there. So Leah, if the other folks who are listening are like me, don't have a lot of experience with adoption, can you just, I think we all have, like, we watched Annie, right? And we was watching Quavanzane and, all that kind of stuff. And that's what it was. What does adoption look like? And I know it's different, but like a few examples of how it looks for a lot of people.
In terms of like how it actually comes to be, like the
Yes,
processes.
like some people, like their parents might pass away, or like, what are the
Right.
different scenarios?
Yeah. So in my case, both my parents did actually pass away, but I was put into the system like before that, but there was no reunification with them just like wasn't possible, right? So that's one scenario. There are scenarios, of course, where um, children are being abused, and obviously you don't want that to happen. So that's another scenario. I mean, there's also people who just aren't ready to. They feel like they aren't ready to have kids, which often the underlying issue is money. And so those kids are often adopted like right at birth. I mean, sometimes the mom doesn't even get to hold them, or they're taken right out of the mom's arms and placed into whoever is going to be raising them. Um, so that's another one. I mean, there's some people who go through like private adoptions or direct adoptions that go straight through a lawyer, and sometimes those can get really, really shady, to be quite honest, because there isn't like a ton of oversight.
Shady in
Um,
what sense?
One more time.
Shady in what sense? Like what's happening behind the curtain?
Um, because it's really a private thing that's happening, really anything can be done, and it's not always legal. It's not always a legal adoption. I mean, a lot of times in adoption, what happens is that people are coerced into giving up their children because they're promised like that they'll be given a better life, or they're promised an open adoption. So
Mm.
open adoption is like such a common myth. It's not a real thing. There's no legal precedence that says that the adoptive family has to keep in contact with you. I was talking to someone the other day on Twitter who said that they wrote it on like a piece of paper. Like there's nothing, it can't be enforced. It really is up to the family. But a lot of moms are sold that, like that they'll be able to keep in contact and stuff like that, and so they think that they'll be able to maintain those relationships. But the truth of the matter is, once there's a termination of parental rights, the adoptive family has no legal obligation to keep in contact or to maintain those relationships, and this is something we can get into later, but this is why I personally advocate so strongly for legal guardianships, because they don't sever those ties. Like termination of parental rights is pretty much permanent. Like there's really nothing that you can do like after that, you know? So yeah, so those are some of the ways that adoption happens. I mentioned earlier, mine kind of went through like in some type of organization that came to the church, I guess, where my adoptive parents were going, and encouraged them to kind of go through with this. I see your
Can
face.
can can we talk about the church, please, Amber? Can we talk about the church with Leah?
I mean, listen, I'm ready because I, as soon as I heard you say they were devout, I was like, Lord have mercy.
She said they were devout on one
Yeah.
hand, and then 30 seconds later, she talked about how abusive they were, and I was like, that checks out. Like that sounds about right.
Yes, yes, it passes the smell test. Yes.
But
So
so
talk to us
whenever
about that part.
Yeah. So, they were seriously devout, devoutly religious. Went to church every week. Grew up singing in the church. All of it. All right, the typical Black church experience. Um, but behind closed doors, they were menaces. Like, my adoptive mom's dad molested me for like 5 years of my life consistently. And then probably like another 2 years after that, kind of on and off. And when everything came to the light,
Wow.
nothing was ultimately done. So, we had this sort of family meeting to address him. And of course, he denied all allegations and things like that. But at the end of the day, like he said, he didn't do it. And that was pretty much like the end of it. And my adopted parents um, still allowed him to come over. And so he still had contact with me, and he still was harming me after they knew about it. And
Leah.
so for me, that's why when I think about adoption, like there's just no way that I can ever think of it as this beautiful thing, because why would you go out of your way to purchase a child, right? Let's talk about that, the buying and selling of children, the trafficking of children. Why would you go out of your way to do that just to not protect them, right? But again, capitalism is at the center of all of this, because they had the resources on paper, like they were essentially a good match. But they don't take enough time to really like look into these people, you know, and really understand like who they are. And I understand that you're not going to be able to catch everything. You're never really going to get to fully know a person, but I think that there are more parameters that could be in place. For example, when you're in foster care, there's a social worker who comes and checks on you from time to make sure that you're in a safe and loving environment, right? And things still get missed there. But when it comes to adoption, when that check is signed and those ties are severed, ain't nobody coming to check on you. A social worker does not come to check on you. Like, that is it. It is a done deal. And I think that is a gross negligence that's happening, because this is, my story is not unique. If you talk to other adoptees, you'll find that there's this common thread of abuse among adoption. But yeah, they hid behind their religion and really were, to the outside, upstanding citizens in the community. Like, nobody would have ever suspected that they did anything like this. And even when I would talk about it, people would just be in shock. And so for me, it was kind of like discouraging, because nobody was really, I won't say nobody believed me, because there were people who believed me outside of them, but it was really hard because they had just built this whole public persona. They were both educators, like
Oh,
they worked
wow.
they worked with CPS, you know, like my adoptive dad he was an administrator, he was a principal. So you're the one who's dealing with them when they come. And so I think they sort of had this privilege in
That's a
knowing how to
mandatory
navigate.
reporter? Like,
Right, as a mandatory reporter. Ain't that crazy?
Wow.
Um, so yeah, religion and adoption is a very, very messy thing. Evangelicals adopt at higher rates than other people, like at twice the rate of everyone else. And there's a lot of encouragement among churches to adopt, and how it's this, you know, biblical thing, and all, you know, all these, and that's how that's how a lot of transracial adoptions happen too. But
absolutely.
but yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you about. Like, a lot of times, I think people easily recognize some of the harmful ramifications around transracial adoptions. But I know for me personally, I've never heard a story like yours where somebody who had a same race adoption is coming up and saying, no, these same, issues of exploitation and all of that, it happens in same race adoptions as well. And so the question I have is, how do you think we can do a better job of keeping stories like yours from getting lost in the sauce? Because I think when we kind of put the picture on, the assumption is, oh, we're talking to somebody who's a victim of transracial adoption. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think it's hard because there are so many transracial adoptees, which is intentional. Um, I think that you really have to be intentional about seeking out like same race adoptees, right? Like, I personally did not start meeting same race adoptees until I started planning for this podcast. And even now, like, I still don't know a ton. I probably know like less than 10 Black same race adoptees.
Leah, do you
So go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I'm interrupting you. Do you know the statistics potentially behind like what percentage of adoption is same race versus transracial?
I don't know the statistics offhand, but um, I know that it's much higher than same
Wow.
race adoptions. And I think part of that is too is like there's sort of this, even when I tell people that I'm a same race adoptee, they kind of look at me like, oh, because Black people, we raise each other's kids all the time informally without any sort of adoption paperwork, right? Like, if somebody is unable, somebody's grandma, somebody's auntie, somebody is going to step in and help raise that baby. But there is a whole other side of that where like that doesn't always happen, or it's not always possible for one reason or another. Um, so I don't know. I think you have to be, to answer your question, I think you have to be like just intentional and like sort of like search us out, because our stories aren't as amplified. And that's part of what I'm trying to do with my podcast too.
I think the system also is completely disincentivized from keeping those types of records, from keeping those type of statistics, because, you know, I think it's one thing to say you don't know and then have the data and say you don't know. So I feel like everybody can kind of pretend like their hands are cleaner than they are if you don't actually keep the data. You know what I mean? So it feels like that's very intentional and par for the course with what you're describing.
So, Leah, tell us more if you feel comfortable about your sister, right? So, you talked about your family and they were suffering from infertility, and then you were adopted, and then they went on to have your sister. Do you feel like she suffered the same abuse as you did? Was there a clear divide in your home?
Definitely a clear divide. I don't feel like she suffered the same abuse that I did. I feel like she was handed the world on a silver platter. I think in part because of my adoptive mother's grief. My sister, she also was born early too. She was born in June and she was supposed to be born in September. So she was born pretty early. She weighed like less than a pound. She had to wear like doll clothes and stuff like that. So I think like the grief of losing a child and the grief of almost losing another child, I think my adoptive mother was like so protective of her, which like I recognize, but I wish she could have been protective of like both of us. I wish you could have kept that same energy. Um, but I think it's hard for adoptive parents to like form that. You formed a bond, you carried her for all that time, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I think it's kind of, it makes sense why it's difficult for adoptive parents to bond with their children. But no, I feel like she had a really great experience. Like my parents really supported her in like a lot of her endeavors and her dreams. And I often tell this story about my adoptive mother. She was really strict about like where we ate dinner. Like dinner was eaten at the table, and like that was that. And so whenever I would go to other people's houses, I just kind of like naturally like did that. Well, one time we went to my uncle's house, my adoptive dad's brother's house, and you know, we were eating or whatever. And so I went to go sit down like at the table or whatever, and my sister took her plate and like went back to the room, and my uncle was like, you just told Leah that she couldn't do that, like what's that about? And for me, that was the first time where I was like, oh, somebody sees me, somebody sees this bullshit that I'm enduring, because I felt like nobody was seeing what was happening, and I was being gaslit into thinking that I was just like a bad
Sensitive.
kid. Yeah.
Okay. I-
I'm wondering while we're talking about this, like, do you feel like, because it's interesting to me to hear you express sort of an empathy and a sympathy towards your birth parents about like what happens when you actually have a natural child. Do you feel like some of this would have been different again if there would have been open discussions about it, or if people would have been more honest about the wrestling and the struggle? Because I know, I have my oldest son. He came to me through guardianship. I became his legal guardian when I left his daddy. I kept the baby and left the man. But one of the things that I always try to do was let him know that if he felt that way, like, to talk to me about it. You know what I'm saying? Because there are blind spots, and I'm just wondering, like, do you think if there had have been more transparency about it and more of an invitation to talk about it, that it could have been different?
Absolutely. I do think that it could have been different. I mean, all that I knew was that my mom died from AIDS. Um, and that was pretty much the only information that I was ever given.
Wow.
So I didn't have a lot to go off of, you know? So I think if there was, and the thing is, it wasn't like there was information that they knew, because when I decided I wanted to go look for my biological family, I went to my adopted mom and I was like, hey, like, do you have anything? And she handed me this folder. And I'm like, oh, so you've just been like sitting on this for a long time and like never thought that this information might be like pertinent to share. But I think like there's just this idea of like separation and erasure that people want to happen. Like, you are now mine, you are now part of this family. But it's like, because you adopted me, that didn't, those people didn't go away. Those relationships and those ties and those connections didn't go away. even though it probably makes you feel uncomfortable or it makes you feel some type of way, like I do think that there should have been like more transparency, but unfortunately there wasn't. But I do think that it would have helped. I do think that it would have helped some because I already didn't have those connections really. So I just kind of felt like I was out here like meandering the world alone.
Did you grow up knowing you were adopted, or did you find out later on?
I will give them that. I did know I was adopted. I pretty much always knew, and so it was never. Yeah, I didn't have to go through like what some late discovery adoptees go through, where they find out much later in life.
And so when I was listening to y'all's show, the you all were talking about your different journeys, right? Sort of as you, like anything in life, right? You move through it, you're learning, you're living the experience of it. And you talked about like coming out of the fog. So can you tell us like what that means to emerge, what the fog is, what it means to emerge from it as an adoptee, and then sort of where that puts you on your path now?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about just how there's this narrative or these fairy tales around adoption, that it's a good thing, it's benevolent, and things like that. So coming out of the fog is essentially like realizing that that's not actually reality. Like we've just been fed, there's this narrative that adoptees are supposed to be grateful. And so it's sort of separating yourself from that and looking at it objectively and being like, hey, wait a minute. Like, just because these people bought me doesn't mean that I inherently have to be grateful. It also doesn't mean that I didn't experience trauma at the hands of these people. And so when you start to come out of the fog, you start to question things and you start to see things for what it really is. And then for me, this kind of started at the beginning of the pandemic, actually. We all were on lockdown. Everybody was at home, losing their minds. And I just had a lot of time to think. And I was like, I actually want to talk to other adoptees because I felt like I could talk to my friends about it, but I didn't have friends who were adopted. So it was like the conversation really could only go so far. Like, so I was looking for more community. And so when I started to look for community, all I found was like for adopted parents and foster parents. And I was like, no, 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 no. I want something
Right.
for the people who are adopted. And I could not find like anything. So what I did end up finding was groups on Facebook for like Black adoptees and Black same race adoptees. So I started joining some of those. Eventually ended up making a friend, Henry. He and I are still friends to this day, but he was like the first adoptee friend that I made. And I think through that journey, that is how I started to come out of the fog. And I would say today I'm completely out of the fog. Like I am an abolitionist. I think the system needs to be torn down, and I think better solutions need to be built. I just finished reading a book called Torn Apart by Dorothy Roberts. It's a great book that I recommend. Like if anyone wants to know more about the child welfare system or the family policing system, as a lot of us call it,
Yep.
I highly recommend reading that book because it breaks it down in a way where I don't know how you can finish reading that book and not be an abolitionist. But yeah, so that's kind of been like my journey coming out of the fog, and then in the process decided I sort of wanted to build the community that I couldn't find.
Curious, because you used the word bought several times, like I was purchased. And it is a clear connection to the enslavement of Black bodies. Do you feel like when you use that language or when you speak about adoption in that way, that a lot of people make the connection, or do you find that people are offended by it, or like how do people respond? Because I kind of got the wheels turning in my head, like, man, we can't get rid of that damn slavery nowhere. The fingerprints of it are everywhere. But I feel like this is kind of one of those areas where I would find it very unshocking if people were like, that is not the same thing. That's you're not buying the baby. Like, do you get a lot of resistance to that language in this area?
Absolutely, absolutely, all the time, all the time. The sort of common responses are like, well, would you have rather have been aborted? Did you just want the kid to keep getting abused? And like people go to like these sort of extremes, but it's like, but wait a minute, like I got abused in this home and I wasn't being abused. with my bio family. So now what? Where does that land us? Yeah, people have strong opinions and feelings about it, but at the end of the day, like, that's what's happening. Like, you are purchasing children. There is a receipt. There are a lot of adoptees can tell
Wow.
you how much they cost. I don't know how much I did, but like, people can tell you that, and like, Black children cost less, and that's also part of why you asked me about transracial adoption. That's part of why Black children, first of all, we're overrepresented in the system,
Yeah.
but then because we're overrepresented in the system, and because we're Black and we're in Black bodies and we're not valued, Black children are sold for less than white children, so yeah, the buying and selling of children, the trafficking of children, that's what adoption is.
So I am in school and thinking and reading a lot about colonization, right? So different projects around the world and how that all works. And as you talk, and I've been thinking through what you're saying, and I think about this internal colony that exists in the United States, if you're talking about Black people or Indigenous people, adoption really feels like a microcosm of that, right? It really feels like this small scale effort in colonization. And I'm just wondering, do you all talk about or make those same sorts of connections? Like Amber's talking about the clear connection that there is to slavery and the buying and selling of people. But do you all make those connections, and in a part of your abolitionist processes or frameworks, do you talk about it in that way?
Absolutely. I mean, the entire system is built on white supremacy. I mean, that is why we call it the family policing system. I think something a lot of people don't realize too is that these systems are all intertwined, right? So like, when CPS shows up at your door, sometimes there's a cop accompanying CPS, right? And I can't remember the guy's name, but there's a Black guy who had somebody filed a report on him. CPS showed up at his door. A cop showed up at his door. He was scared, and the cops shot and killed him over a CPS investigation that they were just starting their investigation. So these systems all work hand in hand, but Black and Indigenous children are overrepresented in the system. And there's this sort of narrative that like Black people, Black mothers in particular, aren't able to care for their children,
Of course not.
right? But it's not so much that they can't care for their children, it's that we don't have access to the same sort of resources, and we're not willing to provide those resources. But I mean, adoption plays a lot into like genocide. I mean, even transracial adoption that's you're stripping people of their
Wow.
culture. You know what I'm saying? So there's that. And then with Indigenous people, like, the whole reason that those adoptions started and the whole reason that ICWA had to be formed in the 70s is because they were trying to get Indigenous people to assimilate to whiteness. And Indigenous people said, no, you will not take our children. You will not strip them of their heritage and their identity, right? And the National Association of Black Social Workers in the 70s took a stand and said, we do not support transracial adoption because we think that Black children should be raised with Black people so that they can have their culture and just all the different nuances that come with it. So yes, colonialism, white supremacy, all of it, like, that is what the system is predicated on. It's on maintaining this whiteness and making white people feel comfortable as they continue to exist in the world, but they're literally, like, all the while they're taking things that don't belong to them, like they've been doing since the beginning of time.
So many people don't even
And it's
think Black people have
interesting.
a culture to take somebody away from, right? Like first they'd have to believe that we had a culture to pull somebody out of. I'm sorry, Amber.
No, but it's also, you brought up a point a few minutes ago where you talked about how so many Black families stand in the gap for Black children, like without a formal adoption process. And then, as I'm listening to you talk, I think about how much these systems create disadvantages for them. Like, I know I do a lot of pro bono work, um, with other lawyers. And so one of the things we're dealing with right now is like we're helping a family where they have custody of children, not a formal custody, but one of the children needs imminent mental health care. And the mental health providers refuse to provide it because the guardians do not have the paperwork to show that they have the right to possession of the children. And so this little boy is getting suspended. He's getting into so much trouble in school, and it is just very clear that he's in mental breakdown. And so we've been able to connect them with family lawyers that are starting the process to help them get the conservatorship they need to literally get the paperwork to take care of these children. And so it's interesting to hear you sort of talk about this dynamic of erasure and talk about like how these systems are really not built about the children at all, because you have people out here doing the exact same thing, helping kids, taking care of them, but they can't even do it because they refuse to submit to the power of the system, right? And that is really sad. That's really sad.
This is one of the things you talked about, school and kids, Amber. You're making me think of, so Amber and I live in Texas, and our children are in Texas public schools. Congratulations to us for that. And as a part of it, in the Texas public schools, abstinence only education is our method of sex education, right? So when my then seventh grader came home, and they have to give you the paperwork. Do you consent for your child to be a part of this sex ed class, which is not sex ed, it's just don't do it. And we're going to tell you about 25 STDs, but not about how you could actually get them. But anyway, so she comes home, and I started looking up the group that offers the classes. And what I notice is that these are the same people who create these clinics for women who are pregnant. And, they recruit them to these clinics to then come because they're like, abortion is awful. You don't want to do that. Let's support you through this pregnancy process, right? So then you can go on and have the baby. And so I'm thinking about how these systems start at the very beginning, right? Like we already have these children essentially in schools being groomed by these groups that then if something were to happen to them, say, no, come stay with us. So what experience have you seen these organizations, and what sort of work should we be doing like in opposition to them?
Yeah, that's part of the coercion that happens where, they're like, no, don't have an abortion. Like, we'll help you, and all that stuff. And then the mom, has the baby, and maybe you still feel like, oh, like this, I'm not prepared. And then they're like, oh, well, you can just adopt your child out. Like, we'll just take care of that. So they're all working sort of hand in hand, and that's really sad that that's how they're. I'm in Florida, which education system ain't no better.
Oh God, we thought
But
you win, Leah.
I was about to say, congratulations, you win.
But no, it's so sick, right? Like, and they're all Christian organizations.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's yeah. But organizations that you can support in opposition. So I would say like abolitionist organizations. And the reason I say that is because, as I mentioned earlier, all of these entities sort of work hand in hand, right? And so once like CPS and once the cops get involved, you've now got like potential like civil and criminal things happening. And now you potentially have a record, which now could make it difficult for you to get a job, could make it difficult for you to find a place to stay, and ultimately could potentially remove your children from your care permanently. So anything that we can do to sort of avoid working with places that are carceral in nature, I think we should shift away from that. But there's the Up In movement, there's JMAC for families in New York. Those are the two that I can think of offhand, but like more generally speaking, um, organizations that are doing like work in the community, right? Those that are like boots on the ground actually know what's happening and actually know what people need. So like when CPS comes, sometimes like they look to see like, do you have food in your fridge? So like partnering with like food pantries, banks, things like that, so that that's not a reason, because that is a reason they will use to take
Mhm.
somebody's kids. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Or maybe they can't afford clothes for their child. So there are, organizations out there like sort of like the wraparound services, kind of like how you talked about before. There's the post adoption wraparound services, but I think those same sort of services can happen prior to that. I saw a group this week based out of Chicago, I want to say, that was called Aunties on Call. It was a Black organization. And I thought it was so cool because that's what they were doing. Like they were helping, like maybe you need a few hours to yourself and you want somebody to like help you with your kids. Maybe you need somebody to watch your kids, but it was all like community led. You know what I'm saying? So we don't have the government and the state in our business, because once
Amen.
that surveillance starts, it's almost nearly impossible to get out of it. Um, so yeah, looking for community organizations that are sort of like doing the work, housing coalitions, right? Because people don't have access to housing. Um, they might go end up in a homeless shelter, and then somebody might end up filing a CPS report on them. All the while they're trying to do the best that they can, but they don't have the money. So the same systems that are all entangled with child protective services, we need to look to those systems, but from a community sort of standpoint, to replace. Because that's the thing about abolition, is that if you tear it down, you have to also build other systems to replace those. And guardianship, I know, Amber, you talked about guardianship. Um, I think that's an alternative, an ethical alternative to adoption. I don't believe anything about adoption is ethical. But I do believe that guardianship can be ethical because it doesn't sever those ties, right? Like my adoptive parents changed my name, like so many adoptive parents do. When you get adopted, you get a new birth certificate. My birth
Yep.
certificate says my adoptive parents' names on it. Those people did not help create me. So things like that with guardianship, those things aren't severed. So you still have your identity. And if you ever want to reach out, and there's also the opportunity, like the parents could get their kid back, right? Which, if child protective services and foster care, if the ultimate goal is reunification, then that's what we should be pushing for, not adoption, because adoption is permanent. That you're not getting your kids back after that.
And I think the ultimate goal also has to be the health and wealth of the child that can't advocate for themselves at the moment. And I know
Right.
for me, that is why I took the path I did, because I felt like I wanted my child to be able to go back when the time came and be able to see for himself. I felt like I didn't have to say anything about his mom or anything about his dad. I intervened as a guardian in their custody case. And I know the day will come when he will have questions about it, when he will want to know. And I just felt like, in a spirit of transparency, I wanted to do everything that way because he can see for himself. You know what I'm saying? When he has those questions. So now that's a court record. It's public record, and he can have access to all of that. Because I think it's important for him in his own sense of belonging and his own identity, and informing his own opinions about his parents, to be able to see it for himself, you
And I
know?
think what I love about your story too, Amber, is that he wasn't an adult, right? He was still a
Right,
minor, but he was of a
right.
certain age and he was allowed to make some decisions too, right? Like he was allowed to weigh in on what would happen to him. And it feels like, and Leah, tell me if I'm wrong, like so many adoptees don't necessarily have the ability to, if they are of a certain age and can make some decisions, that they can do that.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that is due to like this deeply held belief that like children are incapable of making their own decisions. Like children deserve autonomy too. Children are people. But I think a lot of people don't think about that or treat children as people, and just ask them like, well, like, what do you think, or what do you want to do? decisions are just made for them because there's this belief that adults know what's best for the children.
100%.
So absolutely. And so, Leah, as we wrap up, so I was talking to one of my girlfriends, get to talking, and I was like, yeah, finally I'm going to get to do this episode about adoption. And I just feel like, first of all, I need people to stop asking what the answers are. I do. Because we have these really complex social problems, and people will be like, well, what do y'all want to do about the racial wealth gap? What is the answer? And if I knew, right? Like, don't you think I would have? And I just feel like we automatically think that there are just magical answers that exist for these really big problems. So I don't want to be annoying in that way. But in the same way that you mentioned guardianship as one ethical means of handling these situations, can you share with us if you have other thoughts about not solutions per se, but ways that we can handle adoption so that we're not buying and selling children?
Yeah. I mean, I go back to community care and community
Yep.
rallying around each other, sort of these preventative things so that it doesn't have to get to that point, and also just educating people about how these systems work together. In the book I mentioned earlier, Torn Apart, she tells a story of a mom who called a domestic violence hotline because she was experiencing intimate partner violence. And the minute she mentioned she had a child, then
No.
the focus went away from helping her and like finding out more information about her child. Her child went into the system for 5 years. And the only reason she really got her child back is because the little boy was like, I want to go home to my mama. And just kept saying that. And they eventually, like to his foster parents, and he eventually went back home. So I think it's a lot of it has to do with education and community-based care. So whether that's like helping your friends or being involved with various organizations that are helping with what's going on in the community, because I feel like that's really who knows best what's going on, the people who are actually doing the work. And also like the families, like they're not typically asked what they need. They're just given a list, a checklist of things that they need to complete in order to be reunified with their child or not to have a termination of parental rights. But I do think that education is really big, just knowing like your rights, because CPS, they don't have a warrant when they come to your house. They just
Amanda told us, don't open the door. She said,
don't
do
do it.
not open the door.
Don't do it. Yeah, don't do it. So yeah, I think education and community-based care are two of the things that can really help to sort of prevent this from happening. And if it's a case where the child is in harm's way and they need to be removed from their care, then I think guardianship is the way, or kinship care is the way that it should be done.
And in your own personal journey, where are you with your adoptive family, your biological family? Where do you stand?
Yeah, so I am no contact with my adoptive parents. Been no contact with my adopted mom for a while now, and my adoptive dad is pretty recent, actually, within the past couple of months. So I really don't talk to many people in my adoptive family, to be quite honest. Maybe a handful of them, if that. My bio family, I'm connected with like siblings and like some other extended family. So I talk to them, but it can be challenging at time. It brings up a lot of feelings. I'm sort of at this place right now where I'm just grieving a lot. I'm really grieving the loss of my mother, and also grieving the mother that the state placed me with was just not a good person, and she wasn't a mother to me. So I feel like motherless. And so just that's kind of where I'm at now, is just trying to figure out how to cope with that and trying to find ways to like honor and connect to my mom since she's no longer here.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, for sharing your story. And I've just learned so much. And I just hope that people are able to hear the things that you're saying, right? And just sort of change the way that we're thinking about it. So, if nothing else, I hope that some minds are changed. But thank you, just that was so much, and thank you for being so open with us.
Thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
thank you.
So, Amber, do you have homework for the people? Actually, Leah gave us some homework that
She
did.
did.
Yes, you're going to give the homework that Leah gave. We might ask Leah to give the homework again if you didn't write it down.
So, first of all, this is related to the homework Leah gave, but y'all need to go back and listen to the episode on CPS that we did because I'm telling you, it is crazy to me how much these things mirror each other. So normally at this point in the season, we just start and the homework will be get caught up. We're not even gonna be that general. The specific task is go back and listen to the episode. We'll pin it for y'all. The episode we did on CPS, um, and listen to that in context with this because there's so many gems and in relationship. Now, I think if you're talking about what I'm talking about, what Leah talked about, the community minded ways like getting involved, creating and building a community. Hopefully, all of you all are plugged into some way or somehow you can be a vessel of mutual aid and community aid in areas around you. What we'll do as a part of the receipts this week is we'll put up some organizations that are doing amazing work in the area where we are and in the area where other people are that have recommended, like the organizations Leah pointed out. And so hopefully somewhere where you are, if we can't point you in the directions, the organizations we list might be able to point you to somebody who's doing something similar or comparable to where you are. So get involved and listen to the episode on CPS and also follow Leah. Girl, I wrote your IG. What's your IG? Because that's too many words for me.
I was
Adoptees Crossing
talking
Lines.
about reading. I was talking about reading the book.
Oh,
Leah, tell us
reading
again. Tell us again what the book is that you recommended so we can.
No Borders, right?
Yeah, so there's a book called Torn Apart by Dorothy Roberts. I also would recommend a book called We Once Were a Family by Roxanne. I can't remember her last name. But yeah, those are both like two really great books. In my social media, I am on Instagram personally at Leah Love 94, LIA Love 94, and then my podcast is Adoptees Crossing Lines on Instagram and on Twitter.
Say the name of the second book again.
It's called We Once Were a Family by Roxanne.
Okay.
I can't remember her last name, but it's about the Hearts. I don't know, you guys might have heard of it. This white lesbian couple who adopted Black kids, white kids, were under the radar of CPS, but just would up and move and eventually landed in California, took their car, drove it off a cliff, and it was a murder-suicide.
Yes.
Yeah, and it talks about that. And I think that's, when I think about adoption, I think about that story at least once a month because it's so sad, but that's not uncommon. But it was a really highly publicized story. So.
Oh, wow. I never heard of that. Wow.
So a lot of homework this week, but absolutely, I feel like it's worth it because y'all, we gotta unlearn a lot of stuff and learn a lot of new stuff. That's really what we have to do. And so, brokers, as we come to the end of this episode, I really do want us to think about, as Leah and Amber mentioned, how do we build the communities that we want to see? How can we give of ourselves, whether it's in a formalized structure, or how can we just help out some mamas and daddies that need help, that need school clothes, that need resources that we might have? How can we make sure that the people around us have what they need such that they don't have to be burdened by the system telling them they're not good enough? And so let's think about ways that we can do that. Let's think about how we can help to change hearts and minds. Y'all, let's think about these children because we just have to do something different than we're doing now. So thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Brokish.
All right, good people. Thanks for listening to Brokish. For more episodes, visit us at brokish.com or subscribe, and Brokish will get direct deposited into your favorite podcast app on the 1st and 15th. Share Brokish with your friends and join the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Music for Brokish is Come Get Some by Blank and Kit. Until next time, goodbye and good luck.
They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You can play any and every position. From coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking and oh my goodness, let's see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're gonna have a lot of haters coming at you, but what you gotta do is you gotta shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.